Most people assume that money begins with metal, with kings stamping their faces onto silver and gold. But centuries before coins reached much of the Americas, an entire civilization quietly solved the problem of money using something that melted, spoiled, and could be eaten. Because long before Europeans arrived, cacao beans were already circulating as currency across vast distances, used to pay wages, settle debts, and measure value. And the uncomfortable truth is that this fragile, perishable substance worked as money not by accident, but because it perfectly matched the psychology, environment, and power structures of the Maya world, revealing something deeply unsettling about how money actually works. Because money does not begin with durability or intrinsic worth, it begins with shared belief, enforced scarcity, and the quiet discipline of trust. And to understand how chocolate became money, we have to abandon the modern idea that currency must last forever and instead step into a landscape where survival itself was uncertain, where droughts came without warning, where trade routes were fragile, and where belief systems were inseparable from economics. Because for the Maya, cacao was never just food. It was ritual, status, labor, taxation, and ideology condensed into a single bean. And its journey into money followed a logic that still governs financial systems today, even if we no longer notice it. Because cacao grew only in specific ecological zones, mostly lowland tropical areas with precise rainfall and soil conditions, meaning that most Maya city-states could not produce it themselves. And this uneven geography created natural scarcity long before any ruler tried to enforce it, making cacao valuable not because it was rare everywhere, but because it was inaccessible to most people most of the time. And scarcity, when predictable, becomes the first ingredient of money, because a thing that everyone can obtain easily cannot store social obligation. And cacao beans, dried and counted, solved this problem elegantly, because they were small, divisible, and uniform enough to function as units, while still being tied to something universally desired: the intoxicating drink made from fermented, roasted cacao mixed with water, chili, and maize, consumed not as a sweet dessert, but as a bitter, stimulating beverage associated with elites, ceremonies, and divine favor. And here, psychology enters quietly, because the value of cacao was reinforced every time it appeared in ritual contexts, every time nobles drank it during feasts, every time gods were depicted receiving cacao offerings, embedding the bean into the moral and cosmological fabric of society. So when a cacao bean was exchanged in a marketplace, it carried not just economic value, but symbolic weight, a reminder of hierarchy, ritual order, and shared meaning. And this made counterfeiting not just a technical crime, but a spiritual violation, which mattered in a world where religion and law were inseparable. And yet, cacao did not begin as money overnight, because early Maya economies were largely based on reciprocity and tribute, with households producing maize, textiles, pottery, and tools, exchanging surplus locally, while elites extracted labor and goods through obligation rather than markets. But as city-states grew larger and more interconnected during the Classic period, trade networks expanded dramatically, linking highlands and lowlands, coasts and interiors, moving obsidian, jade, salt, feathers, and cacao itself. And with distance came the problem of equivalence, because how many woven cloths equaled a load of salt? How many days of labor equaled a ceramic vessel? And in this space of uncertainty, cacao emerged as a reference point, not because it replaced all other exchanges, but because it allowed prices to be spoken aloud, remembered, and enforced. And this is where money truly begins, not when coins are minted, but when people start thinking in prices. Because once a society can say that a turkey costs 200 cacao beans or a day of labor costs 10 beans, it has crossed a psychological threshold, converting qualitative relationships into quantitative ones. And archaeological and colonial era records, especially from later Aztec sources who inherited and expanded these systems, show detailed price lists in cacao beans. But the Maya foundation for this practice was already laid centuries earlier, and the system worked because cacao was constantly moving, consumed, and replaced, preventing hoarding on an extreme scale, which paradoxically stabilized its value. Because while cacao could be stored, it could not be stored indefinitely without care, meaning wealth had to circulate or be transformed into other forms, like land, alliances, or prestige, creating an economy where money flowed rather than stagnated. And this difference stands in contrast to metallic money, which encourages accumulation and extraction. And this difference shaped social behavior in subtle ways, because Maya elites displayed wealth through feasting, architecture, and ritual sponsorship rather than vaults. And cacao payments reinforced this performative economy, where status depended on visible redistribution. And yet cacao was also deeply tied to labor, because workers could be paid in beans for specific tasks, making labor abstractable, separable from kinship ties. And this shift mattered because it allowed rulers to mobilize large workforces for construction, agriculture, and warfare without relying solely on coercion, as cacao payments created a sense of compensation, even if the system remained unequal. And here the darker side of money emerges, because cacao did not liberate people, it disciplined them, making labor legible, countable, and taxable, and rulers could demand cacao tribute from conquered regions, transforming agricultural output into political power. And because cacao grew only in certain zones, controlling those zones or trade routes became strategically crucial, leading to alliances, conflicts, and military campaigns shaped not just by land but by beans. And the very fragility of cacao added to its effectiveness as money, because a bean that could rot or be eaten forced constant attention, careful handling, and social coordination, making economic life an ongoing collective effort rather than a static accumulation. And this is where the myth of intrinsic value collapses, because cacao had value precisely because it was vulnerable, because its usefulness depended on shared practices, knowledge, and trust. And when Spanish chroniclers later mocked the idea of using beans as money, they misunderstood that money is not about permanence. It is about belief sustained through practice. And belief was reinforced daily in Maya marketplaces, where vendors counted beans by hand, where disputes were settled by agreed quantities,
where children learned value not from abstract numbers but from tangible objects. And yet, the system was not perfect, because counterfeit cacao did exist, with some people hollowing out beans and filling them with dirt, a problem recorded in later Mesoamerican accounts, showing that once money exists, so does fraud, regardless of material. And societies respond not by abandoning money, but by strengthening norms, punishments, and verification methods. And the Maya response likely combines social sanction with ritual condemnation, because economic crimes threatened cosmic order. And this intertwining of economy and cosmology stabilized the system far more effectively than police enforcement ever could. And cacao money also shaped time horizons, because cacao harvests were seasonal, linking economic cycles to agricultural rhythms, meaning prices fluctuated not by abstract markets, but by rain, soil, and labor availability, creating an economy deeply aware of environmental limits. And when droughts struck during the Terminal Classic period, destabilizing agriculture, the cacao-based economy suffered not just materially, but psychologically, because money itself became uncertain, contributing to broader social stress, elite competition, and eventual political fragmentation. And while it would be simplistic to claim cacao money caused the Maya collapse, it is accurate to say that the system's dependence on ecological stability made it vulnerable to climate shocks, a lesson repeated endlessly throughout history whenever monetary systems are built on narrow foundations. And yet, even after political centers declined, cacao money did not disappear overnight, because practices embedded in daily life persist beyond states. And cacao continued to circulate in markets, long after monuments stopped being carved, showing that money is often more resilient than the powers that try to control it. And when the Spanish arrived, they encountered a functioning cacao economy that they initially exploited rather than dismantled, collecting cacao tribute and using beans to pay indigenous laborers before gradually imposing metallic currency. And this transition reveals another uncomfortable truth, because cacao money was replaced not because it failed, but because it conflicted with imperial extraction, as European systems favored durable, transportable wealth that could be shipped overseas and hoarded, whereas cacao tied value to local ecosystems and labor, resisting full integration into global extraction networks. And this resistance was not ideological, but structural, because a bean that rots cannot support distant empires easily. And so cacao money faded not due to inefficiency, but due to incompatibility with colonial power. And this pattern repeats whenever dominant systems overwrite local ones, redefining value to suit their incentives. And what remains most striking is how seamlessly cacao blended material necessity with symbolic meaning, because drinking chocolate was both pleasure and prayer, both nourishment and status, and using cacao as money ensured that economic life was never fully divorced from culture, a contrast to modern systems where money pretends to be neutral while shaping behavior invisibly. And the Maya never believed cacao was neutral. They knew it was powerful, dangerous, and sacred, which may have made them more cautious in its use. And as we step back, the story of cacao money forces a reevaluation of assumptions about economic progress, because the transition from beans to coins is often framed as advancement, yet something was lost in that transition, namely the visibility of values' dependence on environment, trust, and ritual. And when money becomes abstract and detached from lived experience, its failures become harder to anticipate, because people forget that systems rest on fragile foundations, just as cacao money rested on rain, soil, and shared belief. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is that modern money, for all its digital permanence, is no less dependent on collective faith than cacao beans once were. And the Maya understood this intuitively, embedding their currency into daily rituals to keep belief alive, whereas today, belief is maintained through screens, symbols, and institutions few fully understand. And in that sense, the Maya did not turn chocolate into money because they were primitive. They did it because they recognized something fundamental about human cooperation, that value is not discovered, it is agreed upon, sustained, and always one drought, one disruption, or one loss of trust away from unraveling.